to the Heights podcast. It's been a little bit, it's been about a month since we've had a guest on, and so I'm glad we have a great guest on, John Bishop. John, I know you have your PhD. Do you go by doctor or no, it's just,
Nobody calls me doctor. John is wonderful.
okay, John's wonderful. Awesome. Well, we have John on today. I'm excited about having him on because both of us have been greatly influenced by Pope John Paul II and his work on theology of the body, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. And so I'm happy to have him on today. We're going to be discussing masculinity in particular, and this is something that he does a lot in the work that he does. So John, before we dive in to masculinity and kind of the crisis of masculinity, maybe just tell everyone a little bit about your mission, your ministry, how you got to where you're at today, and a little bit of your background.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. And pleasure to be on the Heights podcast. Love what you're doing. And Pope St. John Paul II, it is, of course, good to be talking to somebody who's so influenced by him as well. I am the founder and executive director of a group called Forge. Okay, so Forge is an organization. We're in the fight for the family, but we fight for the family with a strategic emphasis on men. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we fight for the family using that angle, that is through husbands and fathers, in a moment when we talk about the crisis of masculinity in the church and the culture. I decided to step into the fight for the family after many years of working for a different and commendable, laudable nonprofit called Focus, which I suspect many of our listeners know about, the Fellowship of Catholic University Students. I worked for Focus for about 8.5, 9 years. I wore a lot of different hats, did the campus missionary thing, worked for Focus International Missions Department. But as I continued with Focus, I wrote curriculum for them, trained missionaries, and eventually was overseeing 3 or 4 different departments of folks at the Focus headquarters in Denver.
Okay. And didn't you do some theology of the body curriculum for them?
I did, yeah. So Focus has a Bible study. It's a 6-part series on theology of the body, and I wrote that series for them.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. And what did you get your PhD in?
So I got my PhD, defended my dissertation 2 years ago from the Catholic University of America. I wrote my doctoral thesis on basically what we're going to talk about today, but the crisis of men and masculinity in the culture, and then what you might call the masculine genius. All right. So those familiar with the thought of John Paul II know a term that he uses, the feminine genius, which more or less refers to the charism, the gifting, the natural dispositions of women that can be used for good in the world, in the family, and complementarity with masculinity. John Paul II, in the time that he was writing, was really passionate about femininity and masculinity, but he wrote a number of documents, Mulieris Dignitatem, one of them, Letter to Women, which specifically take on the subject of femininity. He has no corresponding documents on masculinity. All right, so he does have Redemptoris Custos, an apostolic exhortation on the virtues of Saint Joseph. There are passing references to masculinity in other of his documents, including in Theology of the Body, but no kind of thoroughgoing treatment on masculinity. Now, when John Paul II was writing, obviously kind of the crisis of the day, a crisis that hasn't really gone away, is the crisis of femininity, of women's rights. And so he's kind of speaking directly there. What my doctoral dissertation did is basically develop the thought of John Paul II using contemporary science to construct what I call a theology of the masculine genius, or what John Paul II might have said had he written on masculinity.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for your work, because this is the battle we're in today. Identity. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? Matt Walsh, who lives in Nashville as well. Maybe you've seen the documentary, What is a Woman?
Of course.
But yeah, of course. So this is the confusion, and we are going to be discussing kind of the crisis and maybe some terms like toxic masculinity and what that even means and where all of this came from. But there's hope. We can't lose sight of that. There's hope for the redemption of our masculinity and being true men. So we're going to be touching on that in a little bit. But why don't you kind of share maybe with people what is masculinity because I feel like we might have to know that first before we get into what toxic masculinity is or the crisis of masculinity. So, or maybe just jump straight into the craziness that men are struggling with. But
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so how did we get to where we're at from the beginning, where there was perfect communion with man and woman and God, where men were men? What did that mean? And what has happened with this crisis of masculinity or toxic masculinity, which is popularized?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. So I'll start by giving a kind of basic definition of masculinity, and then we'll proceed from there into the crisis of masculinity, and then maybe the antidote for where I think society might go. All right. Um, Before I do any of that, I want to highlight something that you said, and that's the hope piece. So I always tell people there's never a better time to be Catholic than 2024, except for 2025, which I'm looking forward to even more than today. There's a lot of issues going on in our culture today. There always has been a lot of issues going on planet Earth. But every issue that the church faces is simultaneously an opportunity. So when I give talks on theology of the body, I oftentimes point to other times in the church's history when the church has been in crisis about something, which is to say that I point to the whole of the church's history. And every time that the world or the church or some combination of the two is in crisis about something, that becomes an occasion for the church to articulate her teachings with new freshness, right, in a way that maybe she hasn't done before. So, for example, if you were to think of the first few hundred years of the church's history, the church was in crisis about, well, what does it mean to say that the person of Jesus is both fully God and fully man, right? And there's enormous controversy of this. I mean, people are being killed, for the teachings of the church on this issue. But it was during that period of time that all kinds of beautiful, theological treatises are written, that we're still, feeling the positive effects of today as a result of that crisis, right? So the crisis in our day is about marriage and family and sex, right? This is the fundamental war that our culture is fighting. And that is, on the one hand, a reason to be concerned. It's also a reason to start a family, because there's never a better time to start a family than this time right now, because we're realizing teachings of the church that were never, articulated in the beauty and the profundity that they were in the last 30 years, of the church's history since the time of John Paul II. So now is the time. There's never a better time to be Catholic than 2024. What is masculinity? Well, to give the simple definition now, and we'll just kind of cash this out. Let's go forward. So I'm gonna say that masculinity, at least authentic masculinity, like to give a simple definition, is the flourishing of male raw material. Okay. So here's what I mean by that. Men and women are different. From a biological, biopsychological perspective, it is clearly the case that there are certain distinguishing factors, dispositions, psychological traits that differentiate men and women, right? And there's a certain spectrum and stereotypes along that understanding of masculinity, understanding of femininity. But there's nevertheless some commonalities, and we could have a very long conversation about what those commonalities are. My doctoral dissertation actually used evolutionary biology specifically the split of the evolutionary binary and humanity's evolutionary predecessors as kind of the cross-cultural male raw material that needs to be perfected for flourishing masculinity. Men and women are different, and that is they have different biopsychological raw material. Okay. Men, as a rule, tend towards being more interested in things of the external world just by disposition, right? Which is one reason why, though they don't have a higher aptitude in this area, men more readily enter professions like engineering and architecture and things of that nature because of the biological disposition that conditions their interests, right? So men they're wired in a certain way. They have certain biopsychological raw material. Authentic masculinity is what takes place when that biopsychological raw material is perfected into something good and holy and virtuous, right? So, for example, another trait of men more broadly across cultures is that men are generally more open to taking risks in many domains of their lives than are women. If you don't believe me, just follow the money. I mean, what is the cost to insure your average 16-year-old male in comparison to your average 16-year-old female? Well, it costs a heck of a lot more to insure the male. And part of the reason for that is that men in general, in particular young men, their risk aversion, right, is a lot lower than their feminine counterparts. Now, you can take that openness to risk and perfect it into something good, right, into positive initiative, right, into a good entrepreneur who's building the kingdom of God or something like that. That the perfection of that male raw material, if done authentically in a way that benefits society, benefits the family, benefits the individual, that's authentic masculinity. Okay. Now, on the flip side, you can have any other kind of versions of masculinity out there that might not be positive, right? Because you can do a lot with that raw material. You can, one thing I'm pretty convicted of, and not in a woke sort of way, but in a way that just kind of acknowledges the reality, you can take a man's raw material in a lot of different directions, right? We have a responsibility as a church to take masculinity in the right direction. Okay, so what is masculinity? Masculinity is the perfection of male raw material.
That's great. That's something, John Paul II in his Theology of the Body, he identifies the sexes like male and female.
Right.
He created them as masculinity, femininity. So you're masculine if you're a male, you're feminine if you're a female. And I've told that to a lot of women, and it's just like, well, that's freeing, because I think women in particular have these stereotypes pushed on them. You got to dress this way, you got to fit into this mold, and then you're feminine. And so they're like, well, I don't want to do these things. And it's like, does that mean I'm not feminine? And then they go into like this internal crisis. But John Paul II is saying, by your nature, you're feminine. But like kind of what you're saying, John, is if you want that femininity to flourish, then you got to live it out authentically, virtuously, for the good of others. But then it can be more toxic and distorted and twisted.
Yeah, so I'm excited to talk about toxic masculinity, but before we do so, I want to highlight how right you are about something that you just said. So, one of the mistakes that I think we make in devout Catholic circles is what I'll call a reactionary mistake, that in reaction to the confusions that are in the culture, we feel a need to kind of batten down the hatches and rewind the clock back to, the 1800s in what might actually be reductive conceptions of masculine and feminine flourishing. Okay. To make that very simple, we force everybody, particularly in devout Catholic circles, to fit into a cookie cutter brand of masculinity and femininity, right? That like you're only a man if you smoke cigars, attend traditional Latin mass, carry a drink bourbon,
the bench 225.
Right, well, I'm certainly like in favor, of many of those things, here's an example that I give sometimes. Wrestle with the fact that the Catholic Church canonized both Therese of Lisieux and Joan of Arc, two women who lived their femininity in drastically different ways, right? But I wouldn't say that either of those women are not women, by virtue of the different ways that they live their femininity, So too, it is also the case that when it comes to masculinity, if your version of masculinity is so cookie cutter, as to only appeal to a very, very small segment of the population, then you're really not doing any service to the masculine population. You're kind of hurting the male population. We as a church, without obviously rejecting the sexual binary or any kind of like sort of straightforward thing like that, need to be willing to recognize different what you might call masculine personalities, right? So, for example, um, the Navy SEAL, man, high T personality, like obviously all about that. And there's something really good there. But we also need to encourage men. Say, like, let's just say you have a man who's very creative. Well, he might be an incredible journalist for the kingdom. You might have a different kind of man who's an artist. Well, you want that man to be a masculine, artistic man as well. Are the images of masculinity that we give to our young men must not be so monochromatic as to only give a particular type of young man direction. We want to be able to give all young men directions as to what their masculinity can become, what they might do with their male raw material to perfect it, so that they might become good, wholesome men, with a sort of a different array of personalities. Does that make sense? Do you see that, Brendan? Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think there is any cookie cutter areas where, for men and women, other than just like biologically, like human nature? So like one example pops into my mind that I've heard some men say, men, like, you shouldn't be a stay-at-home father and have the woman go to work for you and work for the family. I've had some people say that, and then I've had some say, no, that's totally okay, and it can be very masculine for a man to stay at home with the kids and have the woman go work and kind of be the financial supporter. Like I know that's one kind of example, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or.
Yeah. So masculine and feminine roles. So here's what I'll say on that. This is a complex topic that we're certainly not going to solve in the next few minutes. So I'll say this. I think there's a value to society having masculine and feminine roles. And I'll even say personally that in my own life, my wife and I pretty much fit the masculine and feminine traditional stereotype that you might come to mind. So, I work outside the home. My wife stays home, and her primary work is the work of caring for our home, our family, our children. All right. I am not of the persuasion at all, and I think I would say that I'm opposed to anyone who would say that women must be in the home. It's certainly a good that my wife and I enjoy, a good that I would highly recommend. It's beneficial for family flourishing, for society. I am certainly grateful to many of the women who have positively impacted their workplace, their communities, by having a profession outside the home. The example I oftentimes give here is Justice Amy Coney Barrett. She and her husband got creative in how they were doing the home thing and the professional thing, and certainly in my estimation, to the benefit of society. The way that she did that. There is an undeniable reality, biological reality, in the importance of a mother for young children that cannot be understated, and that is certainly at play in this conversation. But that's without giving a longer treatise. I think I'd say that. The only other thing that I would add to it is that I think the forcing of men and women into clearly defined male and female roles when it comes to profession strikes me as trying to force a round peg or a square peg into a round hole, when considered in light of the church's tradition. The post-industrial, post-digital revolution economy does not resemble the agrarian economy, in which many of the norms that are at play in the church's teachings on masculine and feminine roles were written, right? I mean, so it used to be the case in an agrarian society that both men and women worked both inside and outside the home, right?
Yeah.
And the whole thing mixed a lot more, where you might take a blacksmith shop, the whole family's living upstairs, dad comes downstairs and works, but so does mom on occasion. They both go up and down. And I worry that in a society that has things like commute and white collar corporate American culture, what have you, that these roles that mixed a lot more previously, the family was all on a single mission, are mixing less. And that's where some of the problems, some of
Yeah.
the confusions in this conversation actually lie.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. And like you mentioned, I mean, it's not just like women stay at home, like that's just what they're supposed to do, but biologically, like they're the ones where their body has, John Paul II talks about, they pay a special, or the
Right.
man owes a special debt to the woman because she pays directly for that generation, but then has to nurture,
That's right.
and feed the baby with her own body. And that's taxing, and that's going to be tiresome. And so it's like, okay, biologically, we do see why more women would be at home because
Yeah.
of that.
And that's certainly a good thing that ought to be recommended, cultivated, highlighted, cherished,
Yeah.
in the home. I tend to make I don't want to make a complex topic too simple, but I certainly want to highlight the good
Yeah.
that women offer to homes and to children, and the way in which particularly young children have a particular need
Yeah.
for their mother's time in a big way.
Yeah.
Um, uh,
Yeah.
you know,
And I
uh,
think what's happening in I'm just thinking of our culture is defining masculinity in terms of these stereotypical roles. So women that think, well, I like playing with the boys in sports and rough and tough. Maybe I'm a man then, and therefore the world is then saying, yeah, you are. You are
yeah,
that. And it's like, no, we have to go back to first our nature defines masculinity and femininity, but we can live that authentically or um, in a way that's not going to flourish oneself or the community around us. So maybe we can start kind of focusing on masculinity, because I think it's awesome with your mission. When I was before this podcast, I was briefly kind of looking at it. And I think it's awesome that you have a niche of, it's not simply we're helping marriage and families, which you are, but we're also targeting in a particular way husbands, fathers, men,
that's
that
right.
there's a special and a particular role that men need to play for the flourishing of the family and society as a whole. What would you say right now is the crisis of masculinity? What are men struggling with? What is the toxic masculinity, if you will, that our culture is being pervaded by, and where did it come from?
Yeah.
Because a lot of men are just like, this is who we are, and some men are proud of certain behaviors that we would just say very clearly, that's not what a true man is.
Okay.
So what would you say?
Yeah. So I want to be careful in the way that I talk about toxic masculinity, because there's ambiguity in the way that people use the term. Okay. So if we were to articulate, let's just say, two uses of the term toxic masculinity, there's one use of the term that I entirely agree with, and that is that there are certain ways of expressing masculinity that are wrong. Yeah, I mean, you shouldn't beat your wife.
Yeah.
Like if you do that, then you are acting in a toxic, harmful, horrible manner. Don't like, and you might refer to that as a toxic brand of masculinity. Okay. Now there is another use of the term toxic masculinity. Um, sometimes people don't even realize what they're saying, but sometimes the way in which people treat masculinity in the culture at large, and also in academia, is that the notion of masculinity itself is a toxic thing. Okay.
Mhm.
So that is like, conceiving of there being something that is masculinity, another thing which is femininity, is in and of itself a bad thing. And that idea, um, I think, my take is, it kind of starts in the academy, it starts in universities, but it certainly bleeds into culture. I'll give examples of both, the university and the culture. Okay, so I remember when I was considering my dissertation topic, I ended up stumbling upon the writings of a psychologist named Brian P. Cole, who wrote an article in 2021 in the Psychology of Men and Masculinities, a journal published by the American Psychological Association. And in that 2021 article, Brian Cole makes the point that in the past 20 years of psychological literature, in publications across the APA, the American Psychological Association, any article that references masculinity treats masculine traits as negative 85% of the time. Okay, so 85% of the time, a masculine trait is brought up in a psychological journal. That trait is treated as negative, and only 15% of the time is it treated as neutral or positive. Okay, so there's basically, like, at the heart of the academy, there's a sort of a sense that all masculinity is bad. Prior to that, even before, the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, you see grumblings of wanting to throw out all notions of masculinity and femininity as harmful, reductive sexual constructs. So, for example, there's a very influential author in the literature on masculinity. His name is Joseph Pleck, and he wrote a book called The Myth of Masculinity. And what Joseph Pleck, one of the points that he makes in that book is that a lot of people, particularly in the United States, a lot of men feel as though they have to live up to a particular brand of masculinity. One that he likens to John Wayne, for example. Say, like, we all, men feel like they have to be that kind of man. And if they're not that kind of man, then they're a failure of a man. That causes anxiety in men. And so the fact that we are putting this stereotype of masculinity out there and explicitly or implicitly telling all men that they have to aspire to that, when most men can't, we are causing things like anxiety in men, early death rates in men, suicide in men. And for that reason, the idea of masculinity itself is toxic. Like, we shouldn't put a brand of masculinity out there. So masculinity should be deconstructed and thrown out the window. Okay, so that's the myth of masculinity. And a lot of people, whether they're in the academy like that, or they're in a Gillette advertisement, and hashtag me too, they might explicitly or implicitly be kind of subscribing to the position that gender norms in any sense, even if they are wide and inclusive of a diverse range of personalities, should be thrown out the window. Okay. Now, what I would argue is that is the classic case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like we said earlier in this podcast, Brendan, yes, like, the church desperately needs positive images of masculinity. The church does not need a reductive image of masculinity. Okay. And here's why. Let me just highlight this all the more. I mean, so that's the toxic masculinity problem. Okay. I think the rejection of masculinity in the culture is part of the cause of what you might call the crisis of masculinity. What's the crisis of men and masculinity? Well, for the last 2 generations, you can look this up. Best book on this topic is a guy named, rather funny name, Lionel Tiger, who's a sociologist out of Rutgers University, wrote a book called The Decline of Males. In all relevant metrics, education, job performance, general relational flourishing, men are in decline for the last 50 or 60 years in this country. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of different causes of it. I think one of the reasons for it, though, is that men, especially young boys, males, who are in desperate need of a model for their masculinity, are not given a model anymore. Across time and place, there's a universal quality of most men prior to the last, few generations of the United States, where, like, societies had things like male initiation rites. They had images of men for their young boys to aspire towards. Okay, and boys will be boys, but there's another, perhaps deeper intuition in young boys that's even stronger in them, and that's that boys want to be men. But if we tell young boys in our highest places of authority in society, in education, in our religious institutions, that masculinity is a bad thing, or if we treat it as a bad thing in our culture, that's not going to stop boys from wanting to be men. It's just going to mean that they're going to look elsewhere for an image of masculinity. Okay, they're going to look to people like Andrew Tate, who is in large part a toxic man, right? They're going to look to people, or they're going to look to the streets, and or pop culture or something like that. And so in that sense, like, here, this is really important. In that way, the toxic masculinity movement, which has done away with good, wholesome ideas of masculinity, that movement, toxic masculinity, is a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is, it's creating the very thing which it seeks to destroy. By removing positive images of masculinity, it's leaving boys with only more negative images of masculinity and further causing the decline in genuine, authentic masculine flourishing. So once again, for that reason, our church, our culture, like
Yeah.
we have not the option to, but the responsibility to cultivate healthy images of masculinity for our young men. Do you see
Yeah,
that?
I do. And I'm just thinking of like the radical feminists, like radical feminism. I mean,
Right.
their aim was destruction of the patriarchy, destruction of what they would term as masculinity, which was dominating, oppressive. And I even read books on um, certain feminists such as Kate Millett, Shulamith Firestone, Simone de Beauvoir. It was this idea that to be a woman was terrible because,
That's right.
well, we have our biology of giving birth and we're enslaved. So men can do whatever they want and we're enslaved and they can just dominate us and oppress us. So what we need to do as women is escape our own biology
That's right.
and be like men, what they were seen as domineering and powerful, in control, the leaders. And I mean, what we're seeing now is this like, it's almost like a hatred towards both. Like men suck, women suck. This is like the message we're hearing in the media. And it's like, let's just not talk about real definitions and what true masculinity is or true femininity. And that let's all go our own paths, our own journey, and define your own way of living. But then what typically what happens in the world is you have the, what people would call the idol or the popular person that everyone's going to look to because they're the most popular. So therefore they must be what everyone else aspires to and what it means to be a man, like Andrew Tate. Well, Andrew Tate blowing up over social media. And what is he kind of giving off? Well, to be a man, you got to be a bachelor, marry a ton of women, sleep with a ton of women, money, power, fame, all for oneself.
Right.
And that's what a lot of men are doing. We're not getting married. We all know this. The marriage rate's declining. This is an interesting study, but infertility and testosterone levels in men is declining.
Right.
Pornography's on the right. It's almost this like there's no living for others, this outward giving of their strength. It's all just for oneself and it's emasculating us, or some might say.
Right.
And but yet deep down, every boy, every man wants to know, what is a true man? Who do I truly want to become that will be fulfilling? Every woman is thinking the same on their end, that will be truly fulfilling. And I don't think there's a lot, at least in the media, that's for sure, kind of like this real vision. This is what a man is, a true authentic man. I don't think, and maybe in the church, I think it's growing, and that's like kind of the work that you're doing, is kind of paving a path, but also giving tools, equipping them to become that. So what would you say, maybe if you want to touch a little bit more on that, or what would you say is like how, if you're talking to a man, or if you're giving a presentation to men, what's kind of the main point that you want to get across, or what's the vision of where to move forward from now?
Yeah. Well, I'll say a couple things that are, I think, really important as we sketch a way forward in the fight for true masculinity, which then becomes the fight for fatherhood, the fight for family, right? Because you can see how, I mean, obviously, if a young boy doesn't have a true model for what it means to be a man, then he's never going to mature and possess the virtues requisite for something like fatherhood, right? And study after study after study after study shows that kids without fathers, statistically speaking, don't do as well. I mean, go to the National Fatherhood Initiative, fatherhood.org, and check out all the stats there. So now boys might reproduce, They might become biological dads, but they won't become fathers, right? And so this
That's
whole
interesting.
movement, yeah,
I think that's a great point.
right, yeah. I mean, it's not just. I don't want to state this in too sensational a way, but I do want the point to hit home. Right, the fight for masculinity is, for the reasons I just said, the fight for fatherhood, right? And to destroy masculinity, that is to destroy the route to genuine masculine flourishing and fatherhood, is to hurt children, right? I mean, no masculinity, no fatherhood, no fatherhood, no flourishing families, right? No flourishing families, no flourishing kids. And so if you hurt masculinity, if you deconstruct masculinity, that's not like a childish game. To deconstruct masculinity is to hurt fathers. To take away fathers is to hurt children. This is no laughing matter.
Yeah.
Right?
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're enlightening
So
me. I've never connected the dots like that.
yeah,
That's
people have
brilliant.
to
But
see
it's so
that.
true.
Right. Yeah, people have to see that. That this is not just like a cute, theology of the body, like giving talks at like high school conferences type of like, like let's be chaste sort of like, oh, that's good for the kids, but it doesn't really matter for all of society. I don't think that, by the way. But I think some people might not really engage the topic for that reason. Like dig in deep here. This is critical. Now, what's the route forward from here? Well, I'll do a little bit of a sketch of a theology of the masculinity very quickly.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and say 200 pages of thing in about 90 seconds. And then I'm going to talk about the importance of all male spaces just for a moment here. Okay. So theology of masculinity. Let's take theology of the body for a moment. John Paul II fundamentally views humanity through three lenses: man before sin, in sin, and after sin. Okay, just to say it really quickly. I know, Brendan, you're cringing at that very.
I think it's a great picture. People need to hear the 10-second boom.
Yeah. And so when I think of masculinity, I think of masculinity through the same lenses: before sin, in sin, after sin. Okay. Now,
that's awesome.
For this podcast right now, we're just going to talk about masculinity in sin, masculinity before sin. Okay. And I think this picture is helpful. Consider Adam in the garden. Adam is made before Eve in the garden. Okay. And he's in the garden. He encounters all of the things of the world: the dirt, the plants, the animals. He demonstrates his superiority over them by giving them names. Right. And in that, I think you might see something of a reflection of the masculine psyche. And that is that Adam is sort of at home in the things of the world, in the same way that men are at home on construction sites and doing engineering projects and building beautiful cathedrals and what have you, the things of the world, right? Business, something like that. But though Adam has a certain expertise and affinity for the things of the world, Adam doesn't find affinity, doesn't find fulfillment, like real fulfillment, until his whole expertise in the things of the world becomes about the person of his life. And genuine masculine flourishing, I think it usually follows that trajectory. That you might have a good job, and by all means, I'm all about men developing a skill or an array of skills that will really help them to do things like provide and protect and so on and so forth. But that provision and that protection is hollow until it has a person or a group of people. So to all of the men, develop your skills, get good at the things of the world. But you don't really become a man until your masculinity transfers from the domain of things to the domain of people. Are the things of your life about the people of your life? Because the masculine genius, if you will, really comes most to life when it enters the domain of people. Like every man, like say every father, every husband, he has things to say to his wife that he can say as a man that she needs to hear from him. He can affirm her in her identity as a beloved daughter of God in the same way that Adam affirmed Eve as bone of his bones and flesh of his flesh, in the way that nobody else could. Like, fathers, you have things to say to your daughters that affirm them in their identity. That they will feel more from you because you are a husband, a father, a man than they will from their mothers. That is your genius, the gravitas of your masculinity. It will come into play in the domain of your family. The genius of you as a man, in the way that you relate to your kids. I mean, to give another example, I think one of the things that's at play in the genius of masculinity that flows out of it, um, study after study shows that men are kind of like the critical religious link from one generation to the next. Okay, this was most recently confirmed in Communio study. You can look up communio.org, the faith and relationship study released in June of 2023, highlighted the critical role that resident fathers play in transferring religion from one generation to the next, playing a much bigger role than their feminine counterparts. Of course, mothers are critical as well, but the faith of a father is a much bigger predictor to the faithfulness of his adult children than is the faith of a mother. There's a way in which this masculine genius, right, the good that men have, it's at play in the things of the world, but it's even more at play in the people, right? And you become really a man when the things of your life are about the people of your life. So there's a brief I did more than 90 seconds, but there's 3 minutes.
That is well, I think that's, I mean, you're just stirring my mind, because I'm thinking of things in ways that I haven't thought of before. So I want to thank you for that. But I'm just thinking more in my own work. It's I mean, right now I'm not married, but I've had times where maybe I've been with a woman or something like that, and I actually find more value in my work because it's not just for me.
Right.
Like, there's something in me that wants to provide for a woman, whether it's, and then it gives the things of this world more purpose and more value. I don't know if that,
that's right.
if that's a part of kind of what you're saying. Is
yeah,
it?
I think there's a way in which, in the maturation process of any man, let's just say you have a man who's obsessed with his work. This is pretty common. I think it's good and holy and wholesome for a man to have a certain pride in his work. But the obsession, the idolatry that can happen for both men and women, but certainly for men, eventually it's not satisfying anymore. And I think paradoxically, what the call of a man oftentimes involves is to realize that an individual's work, say Adam's working with the garden, ultimately doesn't satisfy. So they look for something that satisfies more, like a relationship with a human being. And that relationship with the human being is both good in and of itself, but then it adds new value back to the profession.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just like, no, I work all the harder now because I'm a dad.
Yeah.
Like, it's just like, there's a reason why. Look at Brad Wilcox's new book, Get Married. I mean, like the studies are clear.
Yeah.
Like, married men, like, advance more quickly in terms of their profession. They make more money. They succeed in all of these different types of ways. And part of the reason for that is they've got some really solid motivation.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so very concretely, it matters. But even like outside of the practical concrete domain, in the deeply spiritual, almost mystical domain, there's a way in which, like, when profession becomes provision, that's good and holy and fulfilling in a way that a profession in and of itself can never be.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not married. I don't have kids, or, but I know the responsibility that then comes, and it's challenging. Like, there'll be a calling of, like, all right, you gotta give it your all in a certain sense, but it's also a calling out of your potential of who you could become and who you could be. And so I think that's interesting, but it's just true. I mean, it just makes sense. Like, the more kids that you have, the more there's going to be something in you that is going to have to call out, okay, I got to work harder, provide more. Maybe it's, I got to be making more money now because, well, we got another kid on the way. So I got to figure out ways. And that's, that's going to change the way you
obviously, see. But yeah, it's very real and very, very good, and does draw out potential in a way that few things can.
Yeah. That's great. Thanks for making that point. So, so maybe you can kind of conclude how can we move forward as men?
Yeah.
what would you say to me? What would you say to Brendan, or, someone who is trying to live out their masculinity? Or maybe
Yeah.
what would you say to the person who's like, they don't have any vision, they don't have Christ because they don't know Christ as the vision of masculinity? Like, what would you say to, as a culture at large? I know you
Right.
can talk probably hours and hours on that,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
what would be kind of the snippet or the core message?
Yeah. I mean, for the culture at large, I'd come back to my point that toxic masculinity is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mhm.
And to take the line from John Paul II, to be sex positive, well, this isn't John Paul II's line, but it's certainly in line with his thought. Um, to be sex positive as a culture is not to deconstruct masculinity and femininity. To be sex positive is to savor our masculine and feminine natures, and the goods that those things
Yeah.
are, and in that sense, and for that reason, the church is the most sex positive institution on planet Earth. So come to
Mhm.
the church, come to the fullness of truth,
Yeah.
where you can find out what it means to be both a man or a woman, right?
Yeah. And
Um,
yeah, when you mean sex positive, do you mean like the actual act, or just like as male and female
as
masculinity?
male and female.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Like our
and that
bodies and
is,
our sexuality is,
yeah,
yeah.
and I would say sex positive here being having a favorable attitude towards sex, and sex being a positive thing, both sex in the sense of the act and also sex in the sense of our masculinity and our femininity,
Mhm.
right? Um, so I'd say that um, for for the church, um, I think the conversations on men, on masculinity, on fatherhood, this is kind of the tip of the spear. Now, I think the next 20 or 30 years is there's something of a masculine moment that Western society is stepping into, where we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And I think we're kind of starting to conclusively realize that that was a bad idea. I just saw a study. Brad Wilcox was highlighting this recently, that rates of religious nuns amongst Gen Z individuals for the first time are on the decline. That is that the trends are starting to turn. And I think what we're
Interesting.
starting to
Yeah.
see is that this kind of like woke ideology is starting to sort of like spend itself.
Yeah.
You can only play the novelty card so far until novelty starts to just becomes, on the face of it, absurd. You know,
Yeah.
where do you go past transgenderism? You know, um, uh,
Yeah.
and so I think I think this is kind of our moment in a way. It's a moment for the family. It's a moment for the reclaiming of specifically masculinity and fatherhood. Patriarchy in the good and wholesome and holy sense. As we do that, um, I hope we don't cling to the bathwater, if you will. Like there was a reason why the culture rejected the kind of some what you might call traditional understandings of masculinity, because in this country and in others, there have been bad understandings of masculinity, and like any time in the church's history, when some true thing comes under attack, that is an opportunity for the church to realize her timeless, never changing teachings all the more in what they actually say, in what masculinity, for example, actually is,
Mhm.
not just in, for example, John Wayne or the Joseph Pleck critiqued version of it, right? So I think we need to reintroduce things like, um, I think there can be good and wholesome and holy rites of passage for young men. It's kind of a popularized book, and he says things a little bit simple, but there's a non-denominational um, author named John. Oh gosh, the book is called The Intentional Father. But I can and that I'd commend to to people. Forge as an organization, one of the things that we do is we try and promote good and wholesome all male spaces that can be places for men to be vulnerable with one another and also build one another up. That I think are sorely needed in today's culture. Um, and more than anything else, I think that men, as a rule, should never feel the need to check their masculinity at the door. When they walk into a church, or into the space of Christians, but exactly the opposite, to bring their masculinity into the church, right?
Yeah.
And to raise other men to do the same. One of the things that Forge does is we create courses for people who want to grow as men. We have one course out right now. It's just called Fathers and Sons. You can see it on our website, which is www.myforge.org, myforge.org. The course fundamentally answers the question, how does a man raise a sexually healthy son in a sexually toxic culture? So how do we bring men into a positive sense of masculinity that will make them great husbands and fathers for the next generation? We have 2 more courses coming out in August. One of them is called Home Church, and it's on basically how one generation transfers the faith to the next generation, but with a particular emphasis on things like male-led rituals of faith. Our final course is called Patriarchs, and it's on the unique role of a grandfather in passing on the faith and in healthy understandings of masculinity from one generation to the next. So
That's awesome.
yeah.
I think you're touching on work that's needed. That's not. I think you're the only person I know who's doing this. So for anyone listening and there's a tug on your heart that maybe you're a father and you want to be equipped and learn how to be a good dad to raise your son, I would definitely check out John's courses. So myforge.org.
myforge.org,
Awesome.
Yeah.
Great. Anything else of where they can learn more about you other than the website? Do you have a podcast or?
You can see the podcast on the website. There's articles there.
Everything's there
as well. Yeah. So starting in June 2024, we'll be posting again every 2 weeks, articles, podcasts, videos, things of that nature. So
awesome.
Check that out. And Brendan, thanks for having me. Love what you're doing too. And thanks to our listeners for.
Thanks, John.